As Brother Bob indicated, my subject is Judah's reformer kings. Dear brethren, we can all learn a great deal by studying the nation of Israel, fleshly Israel, God's typical nation. And we can learn much by God's feelings, how he dealt with that nation. And so before beginning the subject of Judah's reformer kings, let me give an overview concerning the nation of Israel. We recognize that the nation of Israel, in one sense, began at the death of Jacob. His 12 sons became the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. Now, this continued, and the next very significant and important event in their nation was the giving of their law at Sinai in the wilderness. Then, after wandering in the wilderness for 40 years and taking 6 years to conquer the land of Canaan, God had then given them, and they resided in their own land, which they had never had before. Following that was the period of the judges.
Now you can definitely hear me. So we have the period of the judges. Following the period of the judges was the period of the kings. You recall that the people of Israel clamored for a king like all the other nations. God would have preferred them not to have kings. He warned them there would be trials with kings. Nevertheless, they would not hear. They wanted a king, and so God provided them with kings. Of course, we started with Saul for 40 years, David for 40 years, Solomon for 40 years. But after Solomon's death, something happened that had never happened before. There became a separation of the nation of Israel. The 10 tribes rebelled against primarily the tribe of Judah and Benjamin, which clung to Judah. And there was also a few individuals in all the other tribes that also clung to Judah and Benjamin. Now, why did this happen? Well, God not only permitted this separation of Israel into Judah and Benjamin, which became the southern kingdom, and the other 10 tribes, which became the northern kingdom. Because Judah was the most faithful tribe. And the other 10 tribes were less faithful. And God, his purpose, one of his main purposes during the Jewish age was to find fleshly Israelites indeed. And he saw he could accomplish that purpose better by just working primarily with the most faithful tribe, or most faithful 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. And history proved that out. They were more religiously inclined. They were more faithful to the Lord. No, not that God failed then to continue to work with the 10 tribes, but they were just more prone to falling away. In fact, because of many chastisements, eventually God gave up on the 10 tribes.
The battery, probably.
I think I can reach everybody, hopefully. Thank you. So, God essentially ignored the 10 tribes. They became virtually like all the other nations around them. In fact, we know that the 10 tribes went into captivity around a century before Judah and Benjamin went into captivity.
They went into captivity to the Assyrians. Now, eventually, Judah and Benjamin also, because of unfaithfulness, went into captivity to Babylon. Now, they were in captivity, and at the end of those 70 years, you recall where the Lord, through Cyrus, the Persian king, granted all of the tribes of Israel, the individuals that wanted to return to the land, that they could return to the land. Of all the millions of Jews, of Israelites, how many returned? About 50,000. But that's all God wanted. They were the very cream of the nation of Israel. And from the time of the return from exile until Jesus came in his first advent, they were for the most part faithful and tried to uphold the law to the best of their ability. So that when our Lord arrived, there was a good number of fleshly Israelites indeed. In fact, you probably recall on the day of Pentecost, how many were converted to the gospel? About 3,000. And every day more were added to the gospel. On one day, 5,000 were added to the church. So you see, God accomplished his purpose. He had prepared a remnant of Israelites indeed. Now, if we look at the gospel age, the antitype of the Jewish age, we see the same principle involved. Following the death of the apostles, there was a great falling away. Eventually, the great Greek and Roman churches were formed. And false errors and practices began. This continued for centuries, until the 16th century, the Great Reformation. There were some spiritual Israelites indeed, we call star members, who God raised up to begin movements, to protest against that great Babylon system. And they accomplished much. Eventually, however, the great Protestant system formed all of the great denominations, and then they fell away from the purity of the truth, taking on false doctrines and practices. But God was accomplishing all along what he determined to. He was determined to find that remnant of spiritual Israelites indeed. So that by 1846, there was a nucleus of saints that cleansed sanctuary. And then our Lord's Advent, Second Advent, began in 1874, where there was a great number of spiritual Israelites indeed. Brother Johnson, the Epiphany messenger, indicated that there were more won for the church in that 40-year period between 1874 and 1914 than any other 40-year period in the gospel age, including the Jewish age harvest. Did not God accomplish his purpose wonderfully? During the Epiphany, the same principle has continued. What happened following Brother Russell's death? Another falling away from the purity of the truth. Great trials with its divisions and separations. But all along, God's purpose is being accomplished. He is finding his spiritual Israelites indeed, wherever they may be. I'd like to talk about two of the fleshly Israelites indeed that just happened to be kings in Israel. These are two of the three greatest kings of the nation of Israel. And I'm referring to good King Hezekiah and good King Josiah. The other and greatest king of all being King David. King Hezekiah is spoken of in 2 Kings chapters 18 through 20, 2 Chronicles 29 through 32, and Isaiah 36 through 39. I recommend these chapters as good reading. I won't quote many scriptures, but will make some quotes from these chapters. Hezekiah began his reign when he was 25 years old, and he reigned for 29 years. Rather unique, Hezekiah was the son of King Ahaz, who was a wicked king. However, the wicked King Ahaz had a most excellent wife. Her name was Abijah. She apparently was a very good mother to Hezekiah and nurtured him up into the admonition of the Lord. Also, Prophet Isaiah was a contemporary of King Hezekiah, and it's believed that he perhaps was also a tutor for Hezekiah in his youth. When Hezekiah took the throne at his father's death, he was already well instructed and fully consecrated to God. So that in the very first month of his reign, he began to inaugurate reforms in order for the purpose of restoring the true worship of Jehovah God in the nation. So the first public work that Hezekiah engaged in was he opened and prepared the temple of the Lord because it was in ruin. It wasn't used, so it was dilapidated. Hezekiah employed the Levites then to help to restore the temple and to cleanse it. And when the temple was cleansed and all completed, they offered a great sin offering unto the Lord. Now it so happened that the Passover was about due, and it was approaching, and King Hezekiah greatly desired that the Passover be celebrated by all Israel. Very few had been keeping the Passover, and none really kept it properly. The king decided to change that and make that reform. He desired it to be kept properly. But this required time.
This required time. Remember the Passover to be celebrated the 14th day of the first month? Well, there was not enough time to prepare for the Passover for the nation at that time. So they celebrated the Passover on the 14th day of the second month, which, according to the law, was acceptable. Now, Hezekiah not only desired the nation of Judah, the southern kingdom, to celebrate the Passover properly, but he sent messengers to invite all Israelites of all the tribes to worship Jehovah God at Jerusalem. The timing was perfect for the 10 tribes were having tribulations. They were already going into captivity. Many of Hezekiah's messengers were laughed at, but there was several representatives from at least 5 tribes that came to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. The tribe of Judah and Benjamin received the invitation well. Again, they were more religiously inclined, more faithful. And the scriptures indicate that there was no such Passover that had been kept for the past 250 years, all the way back to the days of King Solomon. In fact, the people rejoiced so much in their celebration of the Passover that they added another week of rejoicing. What a revival. But it didn't stop with the Passover. The people were now zealous for the true worship of the Lord. And so they were very generous. They contributed very generously to the support of the priests and the Levites and to maintain the proper sacrifices. A movement was begun against every form of idolatry in the land, not only throughout Judah, but throughout the land that the 10 tribes had occupied. The work went on, the destruction of idols, the cutting down of the obscene high places where they were worshiping Baal. And what was the result of this marvelous work they were doing? The people and the king received great earthly blessings. In fact, so generous were the gifts they were given that storehouses needed to be built in order to receive all the tithes and the offerings. You know, the Lord had promised fleshly Israel that they would prosper in a fleshly, material way if they were faithful to the Lord. Now, different principle with the spiritual Israel. Our blessings are spiritual blessings, but they had temporal blessings that they received for faithfulness. Later in life, Hezekiah did receive, however, several severe trials. And yet the trials that he received developed and manifested his faith and the Lord's response to his trust and prayers are beautiful. The Assyrian king Sennacherib had invaded the northern kingdom and subdued it and took captives away and put other inhabitants in the land because he wasn't bent on destruction. He just wanted to occupy, and he wanted to take away any patriotism that the people he conquered had. Now, 8 years later, King Sennacherib was determined he was going to do the same with the southern kingdom, Judah. He was going to invade them. The Assyrians had conquered other nations. In fact, they were bent on conquering Egypt. The only thing in between them and Egypt was the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah. They were on the way to becoming a universal empire. So what the King Sennacherib would do with other countries is, first he would send letters to them to submit to him. And if that didn't do its work, he would send a representative, a general, to demand that they surrender to him. Again, he wasn't bent on destruction. He just wanted to conquer. These letters that he sent to Judah, King Hezekiah, were very boastful of his great power, the power of Assyria in their great conquests. He said, their trust in Jehovah was vain. Other nations had trusted in their gods, and their gods hadn't delivered them. He said Israel's God could do no more than all the other gods of all the other nations. Hezekiah did make a mistake along this line. He tried to placate Sennacherib by paying him an annual tribute, hoping to avert an invasion. And he sent Sennacherib a great present, of value, great value. Brother Russell indicated that what he should have done instead was he should have trusted in the Lord, and if he had done so, he would have avoided a lot of the trials that he experienced. But Hezekiah had a good heart. And as the situation became more dire, his faith increased proportionately. When they were on the verge of being invaded, he requested the prophet Isaiah that they pray together. And so they joined together in prayer to the Lord. And it wasn't long before the prayer was answered. The Lord answered the prayer through the prophet Isaiah, who sent to Hezekiah the answer, "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, that which thou hast prayed to me against Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I have heard." And the rest of the message Hezekiah sent to Sennacherib, rebuking his boasting. And the Lord also said, "Thus saith the Lord," and this is to Hezekiah now, "Be not afraid of the words which thou hast heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have blasphemed me. Behold, I will send a blast upon him, and he shall hear a rumor, and shall return to his own land, and I will cause him to fall by the sword in his own land." Now, as spiritual Israelites, there's some valuable lessons here for us. No matter how great the evil which assails us, a proper faith will look to the Lord and rely upon his promises for aid. Whether he deliver us from the trial or not, we know that we can count on the Lord for victory. And not look to compromise, as Hezekiah mistakenly did at first. Now, if we fail and compromise, just like the Lord chastened Hezekiah for his good, he will chasten us as well for our benefit. Hezekiah, his princes, and his people showed great faith and courage to resist the great power of Assyria. They were a very powerful nation. And it wasn't long before they witnessed the fulfillment of the prophecy of the plague upon Assyria. Immediately upon the receiving of Hezekiah's message, a great catastrophe struck the Assyrians. Sennacherib's army of 185,000 men died in one night. Now, the Bible doesn't specify exactly what it was that destroyed them, but the thought appears to be that they died from pestilence. Now, one can say, well, how does that prove anything? There may have been some plague that killed all of these men, but whether it was by natural means or supernatural, regardless, the Lord was behind this sentence and this punishment to the Assyrians. And years later, another fulfillment took place. Sennacherib was slain by the sword by two of his sons. You remember what the Apostle Paul said? "Be not deceived, God is not mocked. That was Sennacherib's fatal mistake. He blasphemed the Most High, and he paid for that. Now, as a result of this deliverance, Hezekiah received even more riches and honor. And yet, how true it is, prosperity at times proves to be even a more severe test than adversity. Temporarily, Hezekiah's heart was lifted up in pride because of his great wealth and honor that he had received. And it was around this time that Hezekiah became sick, near the point of death, probably in part due to the prosperity which had produced the pride within his heart. Even the prophet Isaiah sent Hezekiah a message. He said, "To put your house in order, for you will die." This grieved Hezekiah. It led him to the Lord in prayer. He repented for his pride. And the Lord heard him and answered him by adding 15 years to his life. Now, as spiritual Israelites, we can't necessarily pray or expect for something like this, but remember, he was a fleshly Israelite. The Lord was merciful to him. And what was Hezekiah's response? He said, "I shall go softly all my years. We will sing my songs to the stringed instruments all the days of our life in the house of the Lord." King Hezekiah undoubtedly is an ancient worthy and a good example for us of spiritual Israel. The next king, and I'll cover this a little shorter, not because he isn't as great. In fact, he's perhaps even greater than King Hezekiah, but not as much is recorded about his life. King Josiah. For your reading, 2 Kings chapters 22 and 23, and 2 Chronicles 34 and 35. Again, beautiful reading. King Josiah began his reign at the very tender age of 8 years. He reigned for 31 years, so by the time he died, he was only 39 years old. Now, similarly to King Hezekiah, Josiah was also the son of a wicked king, Amon. Josiah's name means Jehovah will support. His mother's name is also given. Her name is Jedidah, which means the beloved of Jehovah. Again, like Hezekiah, wicked father, but a good mother. How important a role the mother has. Undoubtedly, she counseled Josiah and brought him up and reared him in a true worship of God. In Josiah's 16th year, 8th year of his reign, the scriptures say that he began to seek after the God of David, his father. And at the age of 20, he was determined to use his influence and power as the king to completely overthrow idolatry throughout the kingdom. For you see, what happened is that following Hezekiah's death, the nation of Judah slipped back again. Josiah actually was the great-grandson of Hezekiah. He devoted the next 6 years of his life to this work. It took 6 years. There probably were some trials along the way. But he extended the revival and the reform work beyond Jerusalem and Judah to the land that had been inhabited by the 10 tribes. And he was personally involved. in this work. Upon his return to Jerusalem, the next project was to repair the temple, for after Hezekiah died again, the temple had gone into disrepair. But the people were generous again. The money donations were not required, but invited. But they were generous, and the work was completed. They hired workers. They were all paid. During the repair of the temple, a book of the law was found by a priest named Zilch. And the book was probably Deuteronomy. This book was delivered to the king's secretary, who then in turn read it to the king. When the king heard the reading of this book, he rent his garment in dismay, for he realized how far short Israel had come of the demands of the law, and he noted the punishments for unfaithfulness. What was he to do? He sent messengers to a prophetess named Huldah, asking what should be done, that hopefully the Lord would answer through this prophetess. God did give a reply to King Josiah through the prophetess, and the reply was that it's too late for the nation. They have fallen and they will collapse. But for the king, because he had humbled himself before God, it says, because thine heart was tender, and thou hast humbled thyself before the Lord, when thou heardest what I spake against this place, and hast rent thy clothes and wept before me, I also have heard thee, saith the Lord. The Lord spared the king from living to the time of the captivity. He died and escaped that trial some time upon Israel. He also established a great Passover, even greater than that of King Hezekiah. The Passover like that had never been experienced since the days of Samuel. When Josiah died, he was so loved that the entire nation mourned for him. The prophet Jeremiah wept. He was a contemporary with Josiah. In 2 Kings 23:25, it says that there was no king before Josiah that turned to the Lord with all his heart, soul, and strength like Josiah. Neither was there a king after him. He was the greatest king of Judah, perhaps next only to King David of all Israel. Again, another faithful ancient worthy, another good example to us. And may the Lord add his blessings.